Welcome everybody to another webinar in the ELGA International Ecological Law and Governance webinar series that we began in January 2019. I am Jeff Garver. I coordinate law and governance research for the Leadership for the Ecozoic Initiative of McGill University and University of Vermont. I'm with you today from Montreal. And I'm also a steering committee member of the Ecological Law and Governance Association, ELGA. So I'm really excited to be holding the first webinar that we're having on the intersection of ecological law and trade. Of course, that's a huge topic. It's one that I've been involved with for quite some time. My interest and engagement in trade really begins in earnest when I joined the NAFTA Commission for Environmental Cooperation in 2000, where I led a citizen-driven complaint process. I also did quite a bit of research and investigation on the intersection of trade and ecological law in my PhD thesis. And in doing that work, I learned, as I think we all know, that international trade has a long history going back thousands of years. So it is a very rich topic. Today, we're very fortunate to have two special guests from outside of the Leadership for the Ecozoic and ELGA world. Sophia Murphy of IISD and the University of British Columbia, and Susan Bragdon, who's the director of Seeds for All. Oh my goodness, I got that right. I refer you to the information on the flyer for today. But Susan and Sophia have a long history dealing with the intersection, not so much with ecological law, but of trade with food systems. So our focus today is on trade, but really with a particular the lens of food security and food systems. And they together have a huge amount of time spent in looking at those issues. And then we'll have commentaries from two PhD students in the Leadership for the Ecozoic project who have also done some good deep thinking about trade and investment, Shaun Sellers and Tina Beigi. And we'll do this, we'll first hear from Sophia and Susan, and then Shaun and Tina will kind of lead a bit of an interactive dialogue a bit, trying to bring out some of the linkages of what we hear from Sophia and Susan with ecological law, and then we'll ask the rest of you if you have questions or comments. I just want to, before we start here, very quickly share my screen, just as a reminder of what we're talking about when we talk about ecological law. And so this is really a summary of some of the features of ecological law that differ from contemporary law. So it's a different view of the human nature relationship, more ecocentric than anthropocentric. There is a different approach to ecological limits, where contemporary law is quite reductionist. Ecological law would be more holistic. In contemporary law, there's a lot of emphasis on efficiency consistent with predominant economic models, where as an ecological law, more of an idea of sufficiency. Contemporary law, in terms of scale, the state plays a very strong role, whereas in ecological law, there may be a more pluralistic view of that. There are different notions potentially of fairness, where a lot of the role of markets determining fairness is more predominant in contemporary law than it would be in ecological law. And all this together then suggests very different regimes of research monitoring and the ways we may take and adapt approaches to law and governance. So this is our first webinar on law, on trade and ecological law, certainly not our last. It's also one of the first that we're going to get into some agricultural themes, and there as well, we have plenty to build on at the end of this webinar. I suspect that we may end up here with more questions than answers about the intersection between trade and food security and ecological law, and that's a perfectly fine result. That gives us then the stepping stone to do the next set of inquiries we'll do on this very broad and rich set of topics. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sophia, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say. You're on, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I'll do the fussy part first to see about sharing my screen. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. So as Jeff was saying, I am not even a lawyer, let alone an ecological law specialist. But I have done a lot of work on trade and on food systems. I come at it today, I guess, more as a political scientist, I would say. But because I do a lot of work on the World Trade Organization and it's a rules-based organization, it inevitably means working on legal issues as well, and to some extent philosophical issues. So, you know, I'm very kind of committed to the rule of law, for example, as a kind of guiding principle, which reflects my British background probably, and maybe an anthropomorphic bias as well, but interested in things like input and output legitimacy. So not just what is the outcome, what can we live with, what will the planet survive, but also this question all the time of how are we deciding, who is deciding, how do we as a species make decisions about our collective well-being. And I feel that this ideals or the principles of the rule of law are quite important to that. And I'm also very much rooted in food systems and in agriculture. So this whole thing will be about food, and that's, I think, a pretty nice place. There's a lot of economic issues in agriculture, lots of politics, lots of culture, lots of science. So it's not a bad place to be trying to think about something complex, like a big new approach to how we regulate ourselves. So with that, I'm sort of, I wouldn't say I'm going to answer these questions at all, but I think my remarks are basically ordered around. I'm hoping to do this in about 15 minutes. So three big questions about the WTO as a threat to food security, the WTO, meaning the World Trade Organization, as necessary to food security, and then how adaptive is the World Trade Organization? To what extent can we imagine a space like the WTO realizing some of what we want to see and maybe lessening some of what we do not want to see? So I'm going to talk a bit about both, not just about the problems that the WTO throws at us. So thinking about the World Trade Organization and the criticisms of it, and I think some of this would echo the frame that Jeff had just shared. Robert Skidelsky, in his book, Markets and Government, which I have on my desk next to me, talks about the World Trade Organization. Well, he talks about an ideological confluence. I'm not sure that he ascribes it to the WTO, but this moment in the 1980s where you get neoclassical, a kind of revival of classical economics coming at a time of neoliberal politics, which was about deregulating and removing the state. And I think a lot of the culture of the World Trade Organization is rooted in that kind of thinking, how to promote markets, how to reduce the state, and a kind of ideological bias, I would say, to underestimate the importance of the state in creating markets and in regulating them as well. And I've said here, unapologetically uninterested in development. That's not entirely true. There's a lot of rhetoric about development at the WTO, but when you get into the negotiations and you talk with delegates, it's very clear that any concession you might want, for example, to protect small-scale producers or to guarantee a minimum amount of domestic rice production in the sort of global or the domestic offer of rice, you pay for that by taking other kinds of exports from other countries or from receiving them as imports. So there's a very transactional culture to the WTO that's at odds with the more normative ideals that we have in a development context. And then you have this, I think this is more practical, but totally untenable situation right now with regard to what they call special and differential treatment, which is trying to manage the different possibilities countries have according to how wealthy they are, according to how big their market is, according to their political power. And at the moment, there's a very crude binary that says developed and developing countries, to some extent, least developed countries watching. And actually, the least developed countries are among the most trade dependent, and it's not particularly healthy that they have this sort of exempt status in regards to being part of the conversation. And especially when you look at food and agriculture, and I'll show this a bit later on, there's nothing particularly north-south about it. There's clearly built-in advantage to developed countries that they have in the rules, and that is very material. But a lot of the biggest corporations now in food and agriculture are based in what we call the global south. The largest rice exporter in the world is India. The biggest demand globally by region is in Asia. It doesn't really help us to either understand trade or food security to try and think north-south. The big producers of food are divided among north and south, and the big importers are as well. And as I say, the most import dependent, there are a few in industrialized countries, but there are many in the global south that really need the trade rules to work for them. Not just for food, I would say, but also for food, because some of them depend on agricultural commodities for a lot of their foreign exchange, a lot of the money that funds education, other basic needs where they at home. So why else does the WTO lack legitimacy? I think it's isolation, which was deliberately written in. This was a legal question when it was created. It was kept apart from the UN system. It's not, I don't know its relationship, others, the lawyers, international lawyers will know better, but it doesn't have the same, it doesn't have an easy relationship with other UN institutions. There's no automatic access for other multilateral organizations. You have to negotiate that committee by committee. It does have some special agreements, but only with the Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank. It has this strong ideological framework, which is at odds, I think, with a lot of the UN normative frameworks. And it's this powerful, we'll come back to this, it's sort of powerful but rigid. And I think in a way, it's sort of deceptive and arguably weakened by its rigidity because it's not very adaptable. And that's the question I would like to come to at the end, this question of how adaptive is it and whether we can have it better suit our needs. And so as a result, there's a strong rejection of the WTO, especially from civil society. And I think that's based, I mean, there's many reasons, but some of them would include the fact that the rules limit domestic sovereignty. What you spend money on in your food system is to some extent decided at the WTO. There's this greater ideological commitment and less of the pragmatism that is said to have governed GATT. GATT was more accepting, for example, that you needed to maintain employment, that you needed to control things other than inflation as a state. And as we've narrowed the role of the state in economic governance, we've also narrowed the political pragmatism at the WTO among members about what they need to do, which may or may not conform to maximizing trade or minimizing tariffs. I think the agreement on agriculture is tricky, but the criticism of it, it does single out agriculture as different from other goods. I think a lot of civil society would agree, food is different, but it does also then bring GATT trade principles to bear on food systems, whereas previously, before the World Trade Organization, agriculture was more exempt. Personally, I think it's a good thing that agriculture is discussed because there is so much food trade, but it is a problem also for civil society that the rules are there and then not part of a broader food strategy for national governments. These rules are unfair. I touched on that before. There's built-in advantage for richer countries. There's built-in advantage for developed countries who kind of grandfather in exemptions. There's also built-in advantage for exporters, many of them in the South, I just want to say. But exporter rights to export are better protected than importers' access to international markets. So the exporter controls the tap that turns on or off what the supply will be, leaving the importer dependent on not rule-bound. They should be rule-bound, but they're not actions. And then the fact that the rules strengthened the market power of commodity corporations. And I think, of course, some of this happened because of politics. The commodity traders were powerful in a number of the national governments that were determinant in setting the rules. But I think it's also an outcome of this ideological fixation with the role of government, and somehow state enterprise is bad and, you know, private global monopoly is okay. There was an incoherence to it that came from this being hung up on what the state should do that played to the advantage of commodity corporations. They were powerful before, they got more powerful as a result of the changes with the World Trade Organization rules for agriculture. All that said, I'm coming to the part that's more about necessity. Try and go a bit faster here. So there's some pros. The fact is the WTO is multilateral. For me, that's a basic asset in trying to determine what happens beyond the border. Most trade rules are not. These mega-regionals, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the EU alliances, these are not multilateral. They leave out other countries that are affected by the rules, but not present to help decide what the rules should be. It is one member, one vote. Even many UN organizations organize countries into regional blocks or interest blocks in order to be heard in the decision-making fora. The WTO doesn't do that. Arguably, it's not a strength, it's a weakness, but it is true that it's one country, one vote, and that's uncommon. I'm not going to say anarchy is the only alternative, but when you see what someone like Lighthizer might have in mind for trade, it's certainly not very appealing in terms of who would decide the rules and whose interests would be paramount, and to the extent to which you would have norms based on everybody coming away with something from the negotiation. And it is for me, the fact of having a multilateral institution is a reminder that countries shouldn't be above the law. If we think about people or institutions not being above the law within our national polities, at the global level, the point of multilateralism, I think, is to say that countries there too want to operate in a rule-bound way and not to appoint themselves as I say, as above the rules or outside of the norms that are decided together. I think there's some really practical reasons as well why the WTO is important. One, trade really matters. The food sheds, no matter how we think about the ecology of food production, the location of people, where they live, where population is growing, doesn't match national borders. And the science suggests that climate change will drive this further, that just for staple cereal production, we'll need more trade, just more food to cross a border than we have now. Maybe very differently composed what we trade, but the borders are not, don't help us. That the WTO rules going behind the border is probably necessary as well as a problem because of the damage that something like export subsidies do, the excess production encouraged by subsidies, the pricing mechanisms of corporations. There's a lot of things that happen behind borders in big exporter countries that I think have global significance. And then because food security is bigger than agriculture. And so these other rules, and we'll touch on them, I'm sure, with Susan, intellectual property, but of trade in goods, processing rules, environment and trade, digital services, these are all going to be profoundly important for food security. So we won't be able to just carve agriculture out and be satisfied we've done enough. I'm going to move along a bit. These are just, I wanted to show in this map, if you're bright, like darker blue or hotter red, you are either importing in red or exporting in blue more than half of the food you produce. It's a pretty rare condition. You can see either way. There are not many that import most or export most. Most countries are in the middle. And actually, you know, so the US comes in pale blue because it has a marginal net export, but it imports a very large part. Canada's a good example. We import 40% of the food we eat in Canada, even though we export something like 2/3, I think, of the calories that we produce. So the trade matters as part of the point, but it's not everything. And this point about it's not really a rich, poor country binary for trade. Actually, the smaller you are, and especially island states, landlocked states, trade becomes more important, not less important. But you don't necessarily have a bigger voice in the decision making. I think I'm going to jump over all of these things. We can come back to them. That was me setting up food security. I'm not sure that's really the focus of what we want, but I'm happy to go back. And some of these notions of boundaries and the donuts, you know, the minimum floor, what would we want to see from our ecological norms. But these are some elements that I think are important for the adaptability, and that I've been looking at. This is the thesis work I've been doing at University of British Columbia, to see how adaptive is the WTO, and do I see in all the mess, all the paralysis, the failure to advance on agriculture discussions, signs of these kinds of things. I talk about multi-scalar consonants. I think it's a little bit different from start local and subsidiarity idea that you privilege local and add as you have to. I think there's some global issues like climate change that we have to talk about globally. The idea is you don't have to do the same thing at every level, but you need your levels not to be undermining what you do. So right now, the WTO rules undermine a lot of what we want to do locally, undermine some of what we want to do nationally. They shouldn't. But we have lots of national policies that undermine what we need globally. And so we also need to be cognizant of that. And that's why a space multilaterally is important. The democratic accountability is this question of who has a voice and how do we organize our voice. I think the WTO has built-in mechanisms that help and practice that doesn't. And so we need to see what we think about that and how we do it. We also have huge deficits in our countries where the trade agendas are not set in any way that is democratic. And then I would say this question of, is it strong or not adaptive governance? How do they learn and move? The WTO's, as a permanent trade negotiating forum, becomes a place where there's no discussion about what works, what doesn't work, what about experiments, about what, I think if we think in systems, if we think about ecology and about not being able to predict all that's coming, we have to manage the tension better between predictable and transparent and adaptive and sort of learning as you go. So I think I can maybe leave it there. I would come to this last slide, which is my favorite quote from Nettie, who's a Canadian former leader of the National Farmers Union and leader of Via Campesina as well, which is a global organization of peasant organizations. But this idea for me that, the change is certainly possible, but we don't yet manage the complexity very well. But a challenge to ecological law about who's deciding what we need and how do we manage that process and input legitimacy at the same time as we have some clear, urgent concerns with the output, the results we get. And needing the WTO, or at least our legal framework for multilateral trade rules, to change as a result. I'll stop sharing the screen from there, Jeff. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Sophia. You've given us quite a broad picture there, and plenty to dig into a little more as we go ahead. But now let's turn to Susan, who comes at all these issues from quite a different place, focusing on how these various global systems affect small holders, small scale farmers, and so on. So Susan, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I realized I was just muted. I've not shared my screen, so I'm hoping you can tell me if it's working. Yeah? Seeing it? Great.
It is working.
Yes, that's the messy part. And part of me is like listening to Sophia is just like, oh, I want to talk about food importing and what does it mean when a wealthy country imports food versus the 35 least developing countries who are in. But I'm hoping we're going to have some wonderful time for conversation, because we could natter on for a long time. And just so I am director of Seeds for All, which is a not-for-profit here in the United States, but I'm also a policy advisor for Oxfam Noviv. It's a project in particular called Sowing Diversity Equals Harvesting Security. So I can also, people want to see that website. We're working with small-scale farmers, agrobiodiversity, agroecological practices in countries around the world. But I think I want to start, probably an important place, I think, to start is that what we're dealing with is really quite complex, and that everything really kind of relates to one another, and the human brain likes to keep things in silos. But trade relates to food and nutrition, dominant narratives about the market and the primacy of markets, relates to at this stage almost what we even perceive as possible because we get so steeped in particular narratives. But we all have our own areas of expertise, and I think it's really only by linking together that we may have the hope of changing systems, because right now we're rapidly hurdling, if not moving beyond planetary boundaries. And if we look particularly at food and nutrition, the trends are really alarming. So I'm gonna try to bring together these different pieces that are often addressed separately. And perhaps counterintuitively, my entry point is really small-scale farmers and agro-biodiversity to illustrate critical interlinkages, but also the dangers we face because our tendency is to want to address issues as if they were independent of one another. And another thing to say, and I would be interested, I'm also not an expert in ecological law, so I'll be very interested in learning more about sort of the connections between agroecology and ecological law, because small-scale farmers and agricultural biodiversity are central to this concept of agroecology, which dates back to the 1920s, but it's really only in the last few years and in the last couple of years that you see agroecology gaining traction in global conversations and on the global stage. And agroecology, I think, is sometimes interpreted solely as relating to agricultural production, but actually it relates to the entire food system. And it focuses on environmental, economic, and social dimensions and how each one of those interacts with one another. And agroecology is also calling for a legal and regulatory framework that is going to ensure transformative change of food systems. I also don't want to sort of disappoint, because I know the flyer for the webinar said that I was going to talk about how smallholder farmers and agricultural biodiversity can be part of a trade regime and consistent with ecological law. But my feeling it's not really possible under the current trade regime and not under the current narrative that underpins the current trade regime. And it also relates, again, to what Sophia was saying, to the inequities that are in economic development, not just between countries, but within countries, and also on the power and the ability to participate in meaningful ways, which gets back to some of what Jeff was introducing, and both Sophia and Jeff were talking about, is levels of governance, and obviously ecological law has some new things to say about that. I think COVID-19 has also further exposed vulnerabilities to our food system that predated COVID, and it's also actually showing why a pandemic was more likely to occur because of our surpassing planetary boundaries. The other thing I want to make clear is that I am also, this is not meant to be an anti-trade stance, but a question of how trade rules are negotiated and for what purposes. And I think COVID-19, again, with other stressors, but has highlighted the importance of decentralized models of short value chains, local and regional markets. And it also, I think, has shown really the importance of resilience. And it's not just resilience to adapt or resilience to bounce back, but a resilience that includes the concept of power and equity and agency. Because we could, if you look at the United States, you could say, oh, we were resilient if a hospital system was able to manage a surge in COVID-19. But if we bounce back to the healthcare system we have here, I would argue that's not resilient. So when we are talking about resiliency, I think we are talking about and have to think about agency, power, and who's participating and making these decisions. Let me see if I can, yes. So the first thing I wanted to do is to talk about the real food system, because I think for a lot of us in at least in the United States, I shouldn't speak for other places, I think we get very divorced with where our food comes from and also how food systems work in other parts of the world. So I wanted to start really by just talking about the importance of small-scale farmers and the resources that they manage and develop on farm, and how important they are actually to achieving multiple, if not all, of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the UN in 2015. A lot of people, I think, don't realize that there are 1.5 billion small-scale farmers are producing 75 to 90% of the food that's consumed on the planet. And the agricultural biodiversity that they are managing and developing, it's continuing to evolve because of their work. And thus these serve as contributing factors to the stability and the resilience of agricultural production. They provide control mechanisms, but also the genetic diversity that's used to adapt to unpredictable changes in rainfall, in temperature, and into the effects of climate change and all the instability that comes with climate change. And the ecological processes, things like pollination, nutrient cycling, water maintenance, soil fertility, seed dispersal, all to a greater or lesser extent depend on agricultural biodiversity. And the other thing I think we don't talk often enough about is the importance of agricultural biodiversity to nutrition. And I think we'll circle back to why this matters when we're talking about trade, why it matters about what we're importing and what a wealthy country imports versus a poor country imports. So if we, again, the trends are very alarming. So we have over 900 million people who are hungry, and those numbers have been going up since 2016. And that's just looking at hungry in terms of macronutrients. So not getting sufficient carbohydrates, not getting sufficient fats and protein. Probably even more alarming is we have about 1 billion people, again, a number that's growing, that suffer from hidden hunger. So they're missing certain vitamins and nutrients, vitamin A, zinc. And this is causing permanent threats to physical and mental well-being, stunting, blindness. So, we're talking generations that will not recover because of hidden hunger. The other thing that is growing is the growth of overconsumption. So we have over 1 billion people, again, number growing, that are overconsuming, but it's also a sign of undernutrition, right? Poor nutrition. So overweight and obesity, and both hidden hunger and this overconsumption are related to dietary simplification, also related to poverty. And if you look at the forces of globalization, and trade rules are one element of those forces, they are changing the patterns of food production and consumption in ways that are profoundly affecting the human diet. And the global burden of disease now, so in the last few years, for the first time, the global burden of disease is now related to what we eat. So we have all these non-communicable diseases, heart disease and diabetes, literally based on what we eat. We're killing ourselves through what we choose or what we're able to eat. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the connection between trade and this nutrition transition and this homogenization of the food supply, particularly for those people who live in poverty. So let's talk about the industrial food system. So it's important to know, first of all, that the modern industrialized food system, again, I think for people who are younger, they may not sort of know that this is not the way it has been and always has been. It's a pretty new experiment. 12,000 years we, as human beings, have been dealing with agriculture, and this really is a system that emerged after World War II, and it's where we see the beginning of this radical alteration of the way food is produced and processed, and distributed, consumed, transported. All of that started to change after World War II. And the focus of industrial agriculture is intensive, it's high input, it's a linear system, it tries to disaggregate problems. Oh, there's pests and disease, oh, we'll put on some pesticides, not enough water, we'll irrigate. So it's, again, let's disaggregate problems and we'll address one after another without seeing the interactions between those choices. And it focuses, again, on increasing yields and production, and it has no regard for environmental, social, or health costs. So if we're also talking about planetary boundaries, it's a lot of what, well, actually, let's talk about what it was. Since we know how much food is being produced by small-scale farmers, we have 30% of the food is produced by the industrial food system. And many, including me, would say it's of questionable nutritional value. And a lot of also what is produced isn't being produced for humanity, for people to consume at all. It's being produced for our cars and for our livestock. So 1/3 of grain production, 90% of our soy meal, and 1/3 of our fish catch is going to feed livestock. It's also agriculture, if we look at planetary boundaries, biggest user of freshwater resources. It's using 70% of available freshwater today. It also is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think a charitable lowball, guess is, the estimates have it about 30% of greenhouse emissions coming from agriculture, which is more than trains, planes, automobiles, more than our cities are producing. And that number is also growing. The use of fertilizers by industrial agriculture has increased nitrogen and phosphate in our environment and has led to widespread water pollution, to global dead zones in our sea. It's also the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, which you also now know correlates with the rise and spread of pandemics. So we can talk about COVID-19 being as once in 100 years, but I think we have to ask ourselves if we've set ourselves up for something quite different in the future. But the point is agriculture is an optional, right? We have to eat, we have to produce food. So we have to not disaggregate goals, production, and yield from other goals. And my argument would be that this is a new experiment and in agriculture, and it's having and will continue to have irreversible consequences on healthy diets. It's going to have irreversible consequences on the resilience of our food system. And we can't bring back crop species or varieties when they're extinct. They're gone. It's difficult to recapture knowledge once it's been lost or displaced. And it's very difficult to reinstate small-scale farmers once they've been displaced. So if this modern food system isn't working for people, isn't working for most people, and isn't moving us beyond planetary boundaries, then it needs to be more than just tweaked. So let's talk about what that has to do with trade and markets. The world, so again, we have this increasingly globalized system, and it's really influenced by what Sophia's slide was talking about, this neoclassical and neoliberal wedding that started to happen, particularly I think around the 1980s and onwards. And it's a real belief in the primacy of the markets and market-based solutions to ensure all sorts of things, but to ensure food security. And it's also, it correlates then with this idea of weakening of the public sector, weakening of the state, both as a regulator, as a provider of goods and services in its own right. And that belief has also in trade rules limited the space and capacity for national governments to govern their food systems in the way that they might think was best in terms of their public interest. And trade rules are tools of the market. So if we look at the agreement on agriculture under the World Trade Organization, its stated objective is, quote, to establish a fair and market-oriented agricultural trading system, unquote. So the underlying premise then is that a market approach that is embedded in the agreement on agriculture is that the removal of state support and protection of agricultural production is the best way to achieve food security in the long run. And of course, that isn't what has happened, but even if you just look at that as a premise, it's problematic. And I think it's also important to say that this market enchantment is not just something about agriculture. We have seen that expanded into all areas of what we might have prior thought of. This is a social good. So we have private prisons where we have market allocating prison beds. We have a profits incentive to fill prison beds. And so yeah, and it's expanded into healthcare, into social, into policing. So that we see this sort of market idea that markets is allocating goods and services, and it's sort of pervasive, not just in food and nutrition. And I guess I always think we need to stop and ask ourselves and to question this sort of this narrative that has become so dominant, and not ask, well, is it possible that markets can allocate education? Is it possible that markets could allocate food or healthcare? But is it what we want markets to do? Is it in the public interest for markets to do this? And who benefits when markets do this? And who is left out when markets do this? And if it's determined that part of this should be allocated through a government as a provider of goods and services or as a regulator, then you really get back to these questions of government capacity, public policy, participation, levels, democratic accountability, a lot of things that both Jeff and I think Sophia were raising. But if we get back again, just back to trade, the trade liberalization is premised on this idea of comparative advantage, right? So that a country is supposed to produce what it is in its comparative advantage to produce, and then trade for what it isn't in its comparative advantage to produce. So it's all about what's the most efficient thing to do. And it's really, it can be problematic in all sorts of areas, but it's really problematic with food because these trade rules are treating food like it's a commodity and only a commodity, when of course food is so much more. We know food is a human right. And this duality makes discussions of how to achieve public interest goals pretty tricky when we have very differing views about the reach and limitations of a market. So this approach in trade rules has led countries to rely on international trade to meet domestic food needs. And it's resulted in what Sophia was talking about, this rising import dependence and a decline of local production. It's been raised a bias towards cash crops for export over food production for domestic markets, and support for high input agricultural methods over diversified and more environmentally sustainable low input systems. And the theory of comparative advantage also, it's really important to note, it says nothing about nutrition. It says nothing about dietary diversity as a key component of food security, because it really just equates production with sufficient calories and food security. So calories might go up, but as I was talking earlier, you see these other trends of hidden hunger, obesity that are relating to the nutritional quality, to dietary diversity. So also then with this theory of comparative advantage, trade liberalization has tended to support greater product specialization, which is also particularly problematic when you're talking about food. It's one thing if you, okay, I'll produce this part of a cell phone and you produce that. We may have issues with disruption in supply chains and all sorts of things, but it's, and it is certainly more difficult to transition back to a more diverse economy when you become more specialized. But it is particularly, again, problematic when we're talking about small scale farming, where the loss of diversity and knowledge can be irreversible. So in terms of product specialization, you can have a challenge that it becomes insurmountable because you've switched from diverse food crops to things like non-edibles. I'm going to start growing coffee, or I'm going to support horticultural products that will be for export. And it's very hard then to ever switch back into this food production. So even if you had the seeds still available of the food crops, the diverse food crops you used to grow, you have the knowledge and the fertile land, say they're all still available, which is a big if, it would take a season to produce those crops. And in the meantime, that net importing country is going to be vulnerable to, and particularly if you're a poor developing country, to price spikes, to shortages that are due to unforeseen weather events, to pests and diseases, to the financial crisis that we saw in 2007 and 8, and to pandemics and the COVID-19 as we're seeing now. And also the problem is we are exporting the negative impacts of industrialized agriculture. So while we have the agreement on agriculture based on the idea that a free market and trade liberalization and the removal of state support is what's going to lead us to food security, that isn't what's happened in reality. The trade agreements really have not benefited small-scale farmers or domestic producers because we've had big countries like the United States continue to heavily subsidize things like soy and wheat. And so what's happened, and corn, is that these trade rules have opened up domestic markets in poorer countries to products from countries with these highly subsidized agricultural sectors. And because of their artificially low prices, these products actually undercut the ability of domestic producers to compete in their own markets. So if you look at NAFTA, after NAFTA was implemented and adopted, it resulted almost immediately in this displacement of over 2 million farmers in Mexico, and the replacement of these diverse farming system with cheap processed foods. And there was a study that was in the Journal of Social Science and Medicine, and the main finding on this, on the Central American Free Trade Agreement, was that it is, quote, associated with the importation of much less healthy foods. And it goes on to say, quote, the US is exporting ever more processed foods to the region while making it harder for farmers there to supply healthy foods for the local market, end quote. So the other thing, just statistically, if you look, obesity is rising fastest in developing countries and with our trading partners. We now know that 80% of all the deaths that are caused by non-communicable diseases, they are now occurring in low and middle income countries. So how are we doing? So these are some of the statistics. We're clearly not trading our way to food security, and market-based solutions and trade agreements don't seem to be helping us to reach food and nutrition security, and they don't seem to be helping us stay within planetary boundaries. And trade rules thus far have not been able to put food and nutrition security above trade and efficiency as a priority. So if they're going to work in any way, they need to be able to prioritize other goals. Efficiency is one thing, but they need to, over efficiency, they need to be looking at resilience, which is often about redundancy, which markets don't tend to like, sustainability, power, agency, equity. And right now, those things are not reflected in the rules or how they're implemented. And while I do think the situation is pretty stark when we look at planetary boundaries, and the trends are alarming when we look at food and nutrition security, and yeah, they're complex, I think it's again important not to say there's no role for trade and there's no role for markets. We know no food system is 100% self-reliant. Sophia is right in saying that. And there's also going to be unexpected stressors, and we are interdependent. And I'd like to think, when events happen, that we are, as a world, going to be there for one another, and that will require trade. But there's a need to recognize how trade rules have made us and contributed to making us more vulnerable. So if trade rules were the problem, we shouldn't look to trade then to fix it. And I think I often see that instead of saying what was being done to undermine, they're going to tweak the trade rules, but in fact contribute more to this homogenized food supply, dietary simplification, as opposed to saying what's working out there and how can trade rules support us where it's needed, as opposed to being sort of a primary driver looking at food security. I think, again, COVID-19, if we come back to COVID-19, it has shown very much the strengths and weaknesses and also the relation of our food systems and the relationship to agency and empowerment. I know in the project that I work with, when the countries that we're working with, farmers' field schools, with community seed banks, with support for informal seed sectors and seed exchange, far more resilient than countries where that is not the case. So I guess the question is, I should really close up, and I have more slides. Let me just go fast. I guess, yeah, the real question is, are we going to look for lasting change, or are we just going to whack them all? Are we going to just, oh, here's an urgent crisis, so no export restrictions so that we can make sure the countries that don't have enough rice being imported right now get the rice that they need imported? Or are we going to really look for transformative change? And I think, of course, we need transformative change. And so if you look at markets, I think we know that territorial markets and supply chains that are short, they're often key components of agroecological systems. The other important thing is that we have a lot of evidence and knowledge about how these food systems are actually more resilient, more productive, healthier, stay within planetary boundaries, yet getting that recognized at a political level today remains largely absent. So how is it that we get the voices that need to be at the table? How do we get more participation? How do we get those voices? And I do think we are lucky in the sense, I think we're in a time that's unlike any in the past. I think governance continues to be a big issue and one that we need to talk about. But I think this sort of bold transformative change has to start with inclusive and open, transparent conversation with policymakers, but also inclusive, meaning all people who are affected having an ability to participate. And we have to talk about, so what are public monies subsidizing in our food systems? What's the cost to human health and safety? What's the damage to the environment? And what's it doing to ecosystem resilience? And again, bringing into the conversation, we have to bring people, these communities and resources that they are managing, they have to be an integral part of the conversation, which is a big governance challenge. But I think because the silver lining to me is that I think things like COVID, like climate change, hunger, obesity, the fact that we're experiencing it and it's touching every part of the world means there's an opportunity to build alliances that perhaps weren't possible in the past, when obesity might have been a developed country problem, or that the problems weren't as shared as they are now. The global problems maybe are an opportunity for coming together to figure out how do we work together to have solutions that are going to work for everybody. But I've talked too long, but thank you. I've got to unshare my screen now somehow. There we go.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. I think we've had two really interesting perspectives to get things started here. So, Shaun, what are you going to make of all that? What do you got for us? What questions do you have for Sophia and Susan that will dig a little deeper into this topic?
Okay. Well, thank you for that. There's a lot in there that was really interesting, and I've been scribbling notes. I wanted to just quickly address and sort of like clarify just a quick note about obesity, that especially in talking about ecological law, like obesity and global obesity is an ecologically situated sort of construct. Like, it's not just actually from overconsumption, it's environmental exposure that is also part of the sort of complexity of global trade. So I do think that it is a really interesting, that last point is a really interesting way to connect across the world the ways in which our the effects of supply chains and the global food networks affect our lives in unexpected ways. But I also noted about comparative advantage. I spend a lot of time thinking about trade theory. And so comparative advantage, the purpose of that is essentially the scale growth of the economy, that like the benefits that the two countries have from trading with each other is measured in GDP, and it is that both economies grow larger. And which brings me to thinking about a number of degrowth conferences that I have attended this year online. I have been really struck by panelists there suggesting that of all of the different economic degrowth proposals, it's actually trade governance and the relocalization of trade that is closest to policy inclusion. Whether or not you agree with me, I've heard degrowthers sort of expressing this, which I thought was very exciting and very interesting. And it's of course because people around the world have been working for so long to imagine and advocate for a different trade regime other than the neoliberal version of free trade that we have in the landscape at the moment. But not all of those folks are interested in trade reform for reasons of justice or the global ecological crisis. And there is a lot of overlap with traditional protectionism, nationalism, and xenophobia movements when it comes to who is advocating for trade reform. And that makes me nervous because there are a lot of people that want this, but we have really different end goals. And this is where I think ecological law could be a really interesting differentiating factor, because when I think of ecological law, and as you posted on the earlier, like quick primer, I think of attempts, instead of trying to give rivers personhood or to give animals the rights of human citizens, it's actually an attempt to recognize and uphold subjecthood for beings beyond mere human citizens, an attempt to see subjects in the world around us and to make visible the complexity and interconnectedness in a legal framework. And then of course, when we talk about trade, especially international trade, we're talking about mostly global commodities trade, and a commodity being the literal definition of an object, a like and good, as defined by the WTO, that has been stripped of any possible subjecthood and has been stripped of any ecological or social and ecological context in order to facilitate trade and global marketplace competition. So we can't know anything about the actual context of one apple or another, or one cow or another, or one chocolate bar or another. And the WTO, as it stands today, is many things, as Sophia discussed. But from an ecological perspective, I see a lot of its power as an enforcement of commodification, or the enforcement body of transforming a world of subjects in context and relationship with ecologies and place, and ensuring that they become mere objects and they become mere means to an end, essentially sort of enforcing market logic. And then the institutional question I wonder about, that both of you spoke to a bit, is whether or not the WTO and international trade governance regimes that exist, if we can imagine these institutions being an enforcement body for decommodified supply chains, for making supply chains visible and accountable to those who engage with them, from producers to consumers. Essentially, can the WTO have an opposite mandate to allow nations and regions and communities to treat goods, services, and the ecologies they are constituted by and constitute with subjecthood, instead of ensuring, as it does now, that we objectify the world that we share, instead of sort of the potential anarchy that was discussed, sort of leading to essentially more consolidation of individual state powers. So what sort of global governance, like if we don't think the WTO can be a site of transformation, what sort of global governance institution can embody and uphold ecological law that recognizes subjecthood and by default resists the commodification process? Because if we don't, for me, if we don't imagine structures of ecological law at the global scale, I think we risk making allies with folks who want to dismantle the current international trade regime for distinctly non-ecological or justice purposes. And I would be interested in hearing the thoughts of both speakers on that. Thank you.
Well, have at it. I'm glad you get to answer that and not me, but very thought-provoking. Sophia, Susan, feel free to jump in.
You're staying determinedly unmuted, or muted rather, Susan. I'm happy. I was wondering if we would hear from Tina first, but I'm happy to come in. Wow, so great questions. And obviously don't have 2-second answers to any of it. I think maybe just to add into the mix, something like global gap. So the world supermarkets, the world food processors, the largest food companies in the world have an international alliance that you know, introduces traceability and certification of different kinds. And, you know, I think it got debunked, but for a while Tesco, the big supermarket in the UK, had a thing where you could, you know, use your phone and tap a barcode and see the farm from which the cow whose, you know, roast you're about to eat came from. And I just want to caution a little bit what it means to unpack that and who would be in charge of that. And that commodification also has a farmer interest in creating a cooperative and organizing your product to sell, because there's one mill in town, but there's 8 wheat farmers and nobody sets the price except the guy with the river and the mill that works. And so there are points in the food chain that inherently accrue economic power. And there are ways to resist that include some things that we might call commodification. So we just need to not oversimplify who will have power regardless of the system that we put in, which isn't to say that it doesn't really matter, it does, and it isn't to disagree with this basic, that the whole, I think it's also clear to a lot of WTO delegates, this whole idea that production and processing methods don't matter is untenable. And they've begun to be willing as governments to look at this in relation to climate change. And it's sort of good and bad. It's good because that's a really nice big canvas that brings a lot of things we care about, water and soil quality and biodiversity. You know, climate is a big umbrella, but it's also very difficult and it's not easy to see what they will do. But I just want to throw in that part about the commodification of goods is not something that is only in the interests of the large processor, although it is also in their interest. And there's been a lot of work by transnational agribusiness and national large-scale agribusiness to create sort of certification and standards. And it has a lot of potential, but it struggles, like fair trade struggles, to do away with the inequalities of power and political voice still. And I then just say, I really share the concern that a lot of relocalization of trade is not really about relocalizing, it's not about sharing power. It's a lot about, we want to historicize the WTO and understand, you know, the 5 big grain traders have been in operation. I mean, ADM is the newest and it came in the 1930s, but the older grain traders like Cargill go back to the 1850s. They've done empire, you know, they've done world wars, they've done League of Nations, they've done, I mean, they've had a hard time with communism, but they haven't found it difficult to come in where communism has I would say China has provided the biggest sort of most resistant bulwark, and they're still there, they're still present. So we just, yeah, that's not maybe very coherent, but we're thinking about if we relocalize, who will have power? If we go back to the village, if we go back to the nation, the US fights over agricultural policy and the direction it takes predate the WTO, and they predate the fight over price, the fight over power, who has power, decision making. Trade maybe exacerbates it, and that's very fair. But I worry about that. If we were localized without thinking about what else is going on, I think we might miss a symptom for a cause.
Sophia, I'm just going to take an opportunity here to just do a little bit of a follow-up, and I wonder if it's useful to think of sort of monocultures of power as opposed to diverse arrays of power that might result in these different structures, and if that might be something that would be important to keep in mind here.
I think it's a really, yeah, and I think the whole notion of diversity in all kinds of ways is a really powerful idea. This like diverse markets, diverse voices, that biodiversity and ecology gives us a really nice model for a lot of thinking about social socioeconomic systems. And I do think this whole, I passed over so many things so fast, but the place of the WTO in the system is not a good place, and its relationship to other institutions isn't a good relationship. This sort of government phobia about discussing trade anywhere else I think is what's killing the WTO, but it's also obviously not serving our interests. Yeah.
So thank you, Sophia. Susan, do you have some thoughts on what Shaun asked?
Yeah, that was so rich. It's like, woo, where do you start? Because there was so much there. Yeah, and I totally agree. Obesity is it's multifaceted, and it's not just about what you put in your mouth. But I really liked what you were talking about in terms of subjecthood, insofar as you're talking about subjecthood as a way to make visible complexity and interconnections, and how would we do that in a legal framework. And there's sort of this push that or not push, but some places where are giving personhood to rivers and personhood, because I always have concerns about that. We gave personhood to corporations, and are we going, if we start doing personhood approach, that do we actually start, instead of seeing complexity and the interconnections in the complexity, do we continue, does it become a more and more disconnected adversarial sorts of systems? So I love the way your thinking was going, but need to think more about where it takes us. In terms of the WTO, I think, to me, I'm not, again, there are positives in terms of it being multilateral and all that sort of thing, but when you look at food security, and I don't think it can make the shift that we need, and I certainly don't know why we would go to it to be the leader, as opposed to if we could cause the cultural shift we needed that wasn't a GDP focused, wasn't highly influenced by a increasingly consolidated agribusiness from inputs, seeds and chemicals to the food and beverage industry. So all the corporate concentration that exists and highly influences it. Say we could do all that. And so that they focus on things that, trade would be resilient, trade, even with food systems. I would only want them doing that in a narrow sense when asked by some kind of other framework, because trade, it isn't how we get there. It would be hopefully how we deal with, when it's needed and how it's used. And I agree that may increase over time because of climate and that we're interdependent. But we've also caused that to increase and to have interdependence. Well, it's just dependencies in ways that are very unhealthy. So I wouldn't want to just give it to them without some pretty serious thought. Can we change the culture? And I'm pretty skeptical that we can, and also that their whole purpose, we'd have to change their purpose. And I'd rather just see trade as, how does it solve things as identified in other arenas than there. Though I'm with Sophia, I'm also concerned with how, because the WTO is multilateral and because powerful interests aren't as able to get what they want done now as they might have been able to 20 years ago, that they go around. And that's why we have plurilateral agreements and bilateral agreements, which are much tougher and less, I think, conducive for the kind of ecological and approach that we're talking about, that keeps us within planetary boundaries and is, and does all the things that ecological law, as I'm understanding it, is hoping to achieve. I also think it's important to say, when we're talking about trying to support more agroecological approaches. I don't want anyone to think we're trying to go backwards in time to some idyllic place. We just have to face the fact of the money that has gone into research and development, the money that has gone into subsidizing particular crops. If we had put and shifted that into research on agroecology, if we shifted those into subsidize, that the world would look very, very different. But it's not about going back, because small scale farmers are usually food insecure and poor. And that's in part because of what we value and reflect in government policies. And yeah, and it gets me then also just, I think Sophia's right that we've had cargills, we've had big players for a long time, but we have never seen this kind of corporate concentration. And then, neoliberals and the neoclassical economists seem to not understand that Adam Smith, who they, in the free hand, that he was anti-monopoly. He would have used antitrust, regulations. We don't have that. We certainly don't have that globally, and we're not using it for political reasons in the ways I think we ought to, because you got a lot of consumers and you got a lot of producers, and in between there's some highly corporate concentrated interests that are being driven by profit and not other social goals, and a weakened sort of government sector to do anything about it. And again, difficulty, I think, in getting participation in meaningful ways. And when you see participation becoming more meaningful on the international scale, so like the World Committee on Food Security, they were reformed after the food crisis in 2007 and 2008, much more participation of civil society and social movements, and that is very threatening to the powers that be. So right now, with COVID-19, there's this move now to have a food summit in 2021, which will be run by the World Economic Forum and the Secretary General of the United Nations, highly political, not technical, and sort of doing a run around the technical agencies and where there's more participation in Rome. So it is sort of a whack-a-mole that you start getting some traction over here and boom, they move over there. And with the World Trade Organization, if they weren't getting what they wanted there, they went around and did, but I would like for intellectual property, it was the TRIPS plus the intellectual property agreement under the WTO. They couldn't get what they wanted under the WTO, so they just smacked it into the NAFTA, into the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and so we definitely have to get to the problem of power, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And thanks, Shaun, for that question. What I really liked about it is, my own work, I've looked at this idea of looking at hard lock and things that are very, very deeply embedded in systems. And I think your question goes to that. And kind of a typical response would be, oh, that's just not, possible. But as we come face to face with some of our big global and social and interlinked crises, these questions become more and more at the forefront, because the impossibility of the status quo, the impossibilities that are related to not addressing those kinds of questions that get at deep-seated aspects of the system become much more stark. So thank you for that very thoughtful question. And Tina, now I'd like to hear what your reflections and some questions that you have for Susan and Sophia.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone. I think it was a great conversation. I think there are so many stuff in there to untangle that I don't even know where to start. But I'd like to, like, the way that I think about WTO and dynamic of power hegemons within that, they're creating this asymmetrical trade negotiations that are increasingly impacting the developing countries. I want to bring it back to one of the principles, one of the tenets of ecological law that is also considering a ecological law needs this supernatural organization that has the supremacy over regional and local settings. Considering that, I was wondering what kind of, like we have seen in the Bretton Woods organization, like IMF, WTO, World Bank, that is the power dynamics are increasingly creating this hegemony of in this context, the sovereign interest and corporations within the sovereign that serves to their national interests, is how can that supranational supranational organization that the ecological law is envisioning for the future, we can avoid that this organization falls prey to the same dynamic. So that's what I was thinking, and I would like to know what it can, is there any kind of voting system that can include beyond the nation? It can include coming back to what Shaun was saying about the subject beyond the anthropos, the human, like the animal, the plants, the aboriginal people, their customs, etc., even the corporations, like as the nation having the opportunity to vote. This is like one something that I was like increasingly thinking about, and also something that came to mind is that, you know, again, when I'm thinking about WTO, there are, you know, as per Susan and Sophie, there are like different way of, you know, framing this. Like, do we need absolute dismantlement of WTO? And if that's the case, this, you know, what ecological law is suggesting is another sort of WTO and the shortcoming that might come with it. But on the other hand, there are some organization like workforce management is suggesting that why not be instead of dismantlement of WTO, we can increasingly concentrate on strengthening some other international institutions that are concentrating on issues of environment, labor, human rights, etc. And well, of course, that would raise the questions that would that still would that be able to resolve informal meetings that are happening within such an international organization such as WTO and other Bretton Woods organizations, and what about the reduction of inequalities? Would that how would that be addressed, or other you know, rectifying multiple violation of other general principle laws, which affect, let's say, dispute settlement mechanism that WTO has put forward. So these are the things that I am constantly thinking about, and I was wondering what the speakers, how can they contribute to answering this?
Great, thank you, Tina, Sophia, and Susan.
Yeah, those are really good points, because I think we often see calling for new institutions, and I'm not always sure that that's the answer, because then they just proliferate, and I'm not sure that it gets us where we want to go. And I'm not sure that, the WTO needs to be dismantled. It's that there's an unfortunate, I think, yeah, I mean, and it's true at all levels that we treat things sort of in silos, and that, you know, like the World Health Organization does this, and the International Labor Organization does that, and the Human Rights Organization does that. And there has definitely been an increasing understanding that those things relate to one another, right? So there are institutional groups now, the WHO with the Food and Agri, you know, so the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization working with the International Labor Organization. So they are seeing that that they had this intersection of interests. The human rights, if you look at the Human Rights Council, I mean, you have a special rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment. One of his special reports was on biological diversity. And so what is a human right? So it's again human-centered, but it is what is our right to nature, to biological diversity, to a healthy environment. And it's not just talking about, you know, clean water, but really looking at it in broader terms. And there's special rapporteurs on lots of those things. I think the problem is at the end of the day, there just is a hierarchy that comes into play. So if we look, for example, if you at the Human Rights Council and you follow debates in the Human Rights Council, and the very same countries are going to be sitting there in the World Trade Organization. Now we know the World Trade Organization has had no problem going in and saying, this is what your standards will be for intellectual property rights. It used to be highly, you know, that was a domestic national thing. It was, you know, how is that a trade barrier? But it's counterintuitive, but they think it's barrier trade. So they say all intellectual property rights have to be harmonized to this particular standard, including around, you know, plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. So here they're making decisions about that. They're happy to sort of jump into a domestic sphere and say, we're making a treaty, so we're willingly giving up our sovereignty to do that. And by signing this treaty, we do so. But you go to the very same countries and they start talking about the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other Rural Workers. The same countries who were adamant about jumping into your domestic sphere and what you're able to do in governing your food system are going to say, oh, we can't support that because human rights are territorial. We can't tell you what to do about human rights within your own country. And so then they abstain or they vote against it. So they completely contradict one another in terms of what they're willing to do and say in terms of ceding sovereignty or creating systems of cooperation, depending on what the subject matter is. And usually it's depending on what their economic interests are. So I get back to sort of almost what Jeff was saying is like, will reform come because we start to see as a society, and then this affects those who govern us and the way we choose to be governed, that we have a truly common concern that is global and it's urgent, whether this is climate or, you know, pandemics. Will that be the impetus that will try, you know, to change things? Because there's a whole, I mean, if you watch the evolution of the World Committee on Food Security, its trajectory is quite a positive one in terms of participation. At the end of the day, it's still one country, one vote, but the right to participate is much higher than in other, you know, UN bodies. But that in turn seems to be threatening, and we're seeing attempts to run around it. So creating this UN Food Summit, which, you know, I don't know how much people follow the UN politics, but in New York, the Secretary General might do a climate summit, but they aren't negotiating climate, you know, norms and guidelines and a treaty. They are, you know, it's more political statements and trying to support movement on climate change. So to actually create a food summit that's going to create principles and guidelines when you have a body who's already doing it, which is participatory, involves civil society, and is pretty transparent in how it works. And that ain't what's happening with the food summit. They have advisory committees. No one can tell who's being appointed or why. So you do get a lot of times runarounds from this more, you know, democratic and giving voices to more people, and which isn't addressing your, like, what about beyond people, other than I think in the Human Rights Council that they do try to attach human rights to the rights to a healthy ecosystem and environment. Still very much human-centered, but to me that's a step forward that they're actually looking at those things. And definitely, again, seeing an attempt among these agencies to work together. But in reality, there's still, you know, power that now moves separate from the institutions, and they forum shop, I guess is the way I would put it. They forum shop. If it's not working here in the WTO, we will negotiate something plurilateral. If it's not working here at the Committee on Food Security, we're going to create another venue. And that's until something shifts there. And I think that I keep hoping it's that we find more commonality across countries and across social movements, that we are able to more shift the way that we're able to influence these institutions and create more coherence and more true participation. I don't know if that answers your question, but 2 comments.
I would be circling some of the same ground, except maybe more optimistic. So I would say that the Committee on World Food Security is really interesting in terms of pushing boundaries, and before it, UNAIDS was pushing boundaries, and that there have been these institutions created that have a different idea of whose voice at the table should, who should be a voice at the table. And so there's an experiment going on, which does not include the non-human, but it does include other organizations of people. In fact, I mean, the UN, the Vatican has a seat at the UN. We've had supranational entities recognized at the United Nations for a long time. And it's not trivial, like sovereignty as a nation is, as Ruggie would say, more an anomaly in human history than it is the norm. And most people have alliances and allegiances that are both beyond and less than the nation. So I think I think it matters who you talk to. So I think it matters that the WTO has not invited the UN into its procedure, and it's usually present as an observer, but it's not engaged in UN, because I think experience shows that when you sit at a table and talk to people you disagree with, you often change your mind. So I think it's really important. The World Bank is structured around how much money you have. And there is never a space at the table for the countries that depend on the resources that come, but do not contribute to the bank in the same way. That the fundamental premise is basically a kind of shareholder, stockholder premise, and that is inimical to the sorts of norms that I think we espouse. The WTO didn't have that for some reason, but it did build in an isolation from the system. And if you talk to the Secretariat, they're forever trying to change that. They learned from having to negotiate on TRIPS and biological diversity, and they started out very defensive, but I think they evolved in talking to World Health Organization and even the World Intellectual Property Organization. It shifted things, and so looking for spaces in which they are obliged to be. We don't want, this was another thing that I think basically undermined the WTO. I'm not sure we'll be talking about the WTO in a few years' time. Certainly if Trump wins another election, I think that the institution, it's already functionally disabled for now. But the countries put onto the WTO, sort out the Food Aid Convention. And the WTO delegates were saying, no, you sort out, as FAO and the World Food Program, you sort out the Food Aid Convention, and then we'll tell you how to manage commerce around it. They weren't asking to regulate humanitarian food aid. And so I think as much as we can do to encourage that conversation, including not, and I don't think the same zeal is there from the governments to say, oh, the WTO will sort it out for us. And I think we recognize that a dispute settlement is a very blunt instrument, and it's wielded in a very particular way, it has its issues, but it's also very blunt. Most people don't want to resolve an international disagreement with a court ruling. They would rather find some other kind of negotiated settlement, and the WTO needs to make spaces for that to be possible, or our international rules making process needs to find a way to allow that to be, so that there are more varied instruments at the disposal. And I think that would let voices come. That's another thing to say, like eventually amicus briefs came to be accepted. It's been way too slow, and I don't know that it has a future, but adapting what that dispute settlement does would be another way to bring in other voices, other interests.
Well, thank you. We are heading up towards the end of the time, and we could probably go on for a lot longer. But as far as I'm concerned, this accomplished what I hoped it would. I think it put into some sharp focus some themes to develop in further conversations. The questions around the role of the state, the role of notions like subsidiarity, and the balance between local and regional and global governance efforts. We didn't talk about the European Union, which is always interesting to me there, because by having the Union has cut through some of the questions of sovereignty by having an overlay of supranational authority that certainly has had an impact inside Europe. And one question is, does that teach lessons that could be broadened? Well, we're not going to have time for that today, but that's another conversation to have. Another set of conversations around the difference between diversity and some goals that might be built around that versus predominant goals around things like efficiency. Very interesting conversations about power and how the structures and the mechanisms we set up maintain or can shift power, and how maybe, given the state of things, we have to look at ways of shifting power a little more. Interesting contrast between a core idea in ecological law about trends towards monetization, commodification, and high reliance on markets versus looking at relationality, interdependence, and subjecthood of the kinds of entities and things that are involved in trade and traded in trade. Also some interesting conversation around adaptiveness of our trade institutions. And I recalled as I was listening to this, one of my favorite articles in my own studies on tragic institutions. And tragic institutions, which by this author, Brigham Daniels, are institutions that are set up to solve some aspect of the tragedy of the commons, but become tragic in themselves because they're not adaptive. They don't have such mechanisms in place to adjust to new information, to monitor what's going on, to make adjustments against whatever goals they're pursuing. And of course, we had some interesting conversation here about what goals do we want to pursue in a trade mechanism. And then we also had some interesting conversation about how trade has tended to be isolated from some of the other topics for whatever reasons. And we got some hints of what that might be. But how trade, but also some of the other institutions at the global level and even at other levels tend to get isolated and siloized around health, around environment, around trade, and around other things. And then once that happens, then hierarchies of power develop among them. And so there was a lot of fodder in this discussion for future discussions about how, if we do have those hierarchies, how do you overcome the isolation? What do you do about those hierarchies? So that's my attempt to sort of consolidate some of the outcomes here and the things that we might together in ELGA and in other conversations develop further. And of course, this is all in a focus primarily on trade and agriculture. And of course, there's much more involved. So I really want to thank all four of you, Sophia, Susan, Shaun, and Tina. You really created a really good conversation. And I want to remind people that we have two more webinars coming up. On September 16th, we'll have a webinar on Indigenous legal traditions. And on October 21st, also a Wednesday, we'll have a dialogue about the intersection of race and ecological law. So we have some really good topics to follow up on this one. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again, the four of you, for your wonderful presentations and discussion.